The kin of the Leagues of Votann are a human offshoot from eons past, genetically engineered for hardiness and a resistance to the mutating powers of chaos and alien influence. In recent times, they have formed into a series of mercantile conglomerates known as guilds, and range out about the galaxy to secure resources, mining claims, and trade alliances, as well as to protect and consolidate those gains. Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and today we're going to be talking about how to play Leagues of Votann and begin collecting an army. In this video, I'm going to walk you through collecting a Votann force, building it out from a combat patrol through an incursion level game, as well as talking about some of the core mechanics of the faction, talking about how to play them, tactics you can use alongside them, and ways to expand the army from there. On the battlefield, the Leagues of Votann possess an above-average survivability, with the defensive characteristics of the entire faction coming in well above that of other similar factions. With an emphasis on claiming and consolidating resources, they tend to play aggressively, moving forward with heavily armored units, absorbing enemy attacks before delivering devastating counterstrikes, with huge bonuses if they attack enemies on objectives that they are trying to claim for their guild. This is manifested in the Votann army ability Prioritized Efficiency, which gives them a totally unique resource mechanic that no other faction has access to. These yield points are generated by holding objectives around the battlefield, giving yield points each player's command phase for holding the objective in your deployment zone, as well as Battle Round 2 onwards for holding objective markers in no man's land or in your opponent's deployment zone. This incentivizes Votann armies to push forward aggressively, consolidate their claim over those midboard objectives, and generate a ton of yield points. The number of yield points in your bank determines the directive that this Leagues of Votann army is undergoing, whether that is to range out and take new objectives under the hostile acquisition ability, or if once you have claimed enough objectives and your mining guild is ready to start exploiting those resources, it switches over to the fortified takeover ability. While yield points are universal and you will always have access to them as a resource mechanic, which many stratagems and abilities in the army will use, depending on how many you have in that bank, your army ability will change, making this totally unique in terms of abilities in the game. If you have less than 7 yield points, the army will be affected by hostile acquisition. This gives them rerolls on advance and charge rolls, making them very good at getting onto objectives in order to fight, as well as granting them +1 to hit, targeting enemies that are within range of an objective marker. Leagues of Votann tend to have middling to poor weapon skill and ballistic skill characteristics, so benefiting from the hit bonuses from their army ability is a huge deal for getting efficiency out of the army. Later on during the game, once you gain 7 or more yield points, if you have that many yield points at the end of your command phase, you can switch into Fortify Takeover, which then gives you a defensive mechanic. If any enemies target your infantry or mounted, your non-vehicle units, with weapons of a strength characteristic higher than your toughness, they get -1 to wound, meaning that no attack can wound a Votann infantry or mounted unit on 2s while Fortify Takeover is active, and most enemy attacks will be wounding on 3s, making them incredibly sticky to remove. This changes where you get your hit bonus, however, giving you a hit bonus if you are in range of an objective marker you control. Unfortunately, this does mean that your opponent has the opportunity to contest or control those objective markers and take them back from you to deny your +1 to hit, meaning that the more common way to get a hit bonus is using the original ability, Hostile Acquisition. However, a thing to keep in mind is that based on your number of yield points at the end of your command phase, the ability will flip. The priority of the guild will change regardless of what you want to do on the battlefield. So in some cases, it's worth either spending down, or some unit abilities allow you to entirely remove yield points from your pool in order to keep your army ability in Hostile Acquisition, which can not only give you easy access to +1 to hit, but also the mode your ability is in can affect some stratagems and abilities elsewhere in the army. This gives Votann a lot of flexibility. They can act more offensively with greater speed or offensive power, or more defensively towards the later end of the game. However, you don't necessarily want to always progress your ability to the more advanced version. This video is brought to you by the Magnet Baron. Magnet Baron is your one-stop shop for all of your miniature magnetization needs. If you are looking to get into some of the new big stompy factions that have just released, Magnet Baron wants me to talk to you about their new no-drill magnet kits. These are kits that apply alongside large miniatures like Imperial Knight and give you replacement parts as well as magnets that allow you to utilize the entire kit, adding specialized attachments and joints that allow you to add magnets into the construction of the model, allowing you to easily swap your weapons on and off. With how fast the metagame of 10th edition Warhammer 40k changes, having flexible weapon options on your models just makes sense, and especially for these expensive vehicle and Titan kits that have a wide variety of options available to them, magnets are the way to go. So check them out at themagnetbaron.com. Links are in the video description. Big thanks to Magnet Baron for sponsoring this video. Now let's get back to it. Now, getting started with building your collection, I always recommend that players begin with the Combat Patrol. And the Leagues of Votann Combat Patrol has some good units to begin with when building up your army. First of all, you get some absolute faction staples. Units like Hearthkin Warriors are going to be included in a lot of your builds, as well as Brokir Thunderkin, which are one of the most powerful army support units in the entire codex. The Hearthkin Warriors are going to need a little bit of support to make useful on the battlefield, but once we expand our army, we're going to be able to include that pretty easily. Now, we also then have a unit of Einhir Hearthguard as well as an Einhir Champion. Now, this is the one unit that may see a little bit less play. We do have a way we can make a lot of use out of this unit and this character combination once we move up into larger games, and I'll be talking about that throughout this video. However, if you don't want to play these guys and you don't want to put the effort into making this unit sing, they are a little bit more difficult to play than some of the other units, so you could very easily replace them once you expand your collection with something like Ironkin Steeljacks later on. However, when constructing sample armies for this video, I'm going to try to use all of these units to their fullest, so we are going to be sticking with the Einhir Hearthguard for the time being. Now, when expanding the army out to 1,000 points, we're essentially doubling the size of the collection. Now, anytime I build armies for this series, what I'm going to be doing is constructing an army that comes in at less than 1,000 points in case you want to add some enhancements or some additional effects. Now, in this case, we are going to be talking about one enhancement in particular because there's a combination that I think is important to make use of units like the Einhir Hearthguard. However, there are some points left over in case you want to do some additional swaps in here, or if these points values change in the future. Now, moving on to Incursion level games, we're going to start to use the standard army construction rules for Warhammer 40k, which means we have to choose a detachment. And the detachment that we're going to be going with this time is the most straightforward detachment, the Need Guard Oathband. Now, the ability for this detachment is incredibly easy to remember. You gain a yield point each time you destroy an enemy. That's all you need to keep in mind, is that your yield point total is going to be increasing as you kill enemies. Don't forget your other sources of yield point generation, which is also holding objectives either in your deployment zone at the start of the game and then expanding out into the other objectives around No Man's Land and your opponent's deployment zone from Battle Round 2 onwards. That's all very important because many of the stratagems in this detachment require that you spend yield points in order to either enhance their effect or to unlock their bonus. So, destroying units will make your army more effective as you move on. Now, there's a lot of really useful stratagems in this detachment. This includes things like Ordered Retreat, which allows you to shoot and charge when you fall back. That makes the detachment incredibly good at skirmishing with your opponent and just generally being a flexible detachment overall. We also have things like Hunter's Mark to give you reroll ones to hit and wound, as well as Reactive Reprisal if you are in Fortified Takeover, so you have yield points in your bank, at least 7 or more. But the two sort of signature stratagems of the detachment are Ancestral Sentence and Void Hardened. Void Hardened is an Armor of Contempt effect. That means it reduces incoming armor penetration characteristics of enemy attacks for a single attack sequence. Given that most of the units in our army are going to be relatively high toughness as well as high saving throw, besides the Hearthkin Warriors in this particular list, every single unit is at least a 3+ save, with the Brokir Thunderkin and the Sachator coming in at 3+, or a 2+ save when we're discussing things like the Einhir Hearthguard or the Hecatan Land Fortress. So, this particular build is going to use Void Hardened extremely effectively. In addition to that, we also have Ancestral Sentence. This requires you to spend 3 yield points when you use the stratagem, but otherwise only costs a command point. If you use the stratagem without spending any yield points, you gain Sustained Hits 1 on your attacks. However, the enhanced version, if you spend 3 yield points, gives you Sustained Hits 2. So every single critical hit you score, that being a hit roll of a 6. However, we will have ways to manipulate those in the future. Once we talk about Strike Force games, becomes 2 additional hits, so 3 hits in total. If you are attacking a bunch of times or have hit rerolls on your unit, this stratagem goes absolutely crazy. Or, if I mentioned before, you have enhanced critical effects. Now, moving over to the list, the big addition here is a Hecaton Land Fortress. Now, these are enormous heavy combat vehicles. They have a ton of attacks, they have baked-in reroll 1s to hit, and are very difficult to remove. This is going to be the mainstay of a lot of our armies moving forward, because essentially what you want to do is force your opponent to deal with this thing so you can entice them onto objectives and into the range to be attacked from the rest of your army. They're also a good delivery system for slower units like Brokir Thunderkin or Chthonian Berserks that we'll talk about later on, and they force your opponent to overcommit to kill them, especially if you're representing Void Hardened and you're holding command points to spend that, because that 2+ armor save, especially with cover and armor penetration characteristic reduction effects, can be extremely difficult to get through. Now, in addition to that, we've also added a couple of additions to basically further utilize the units that were in the combat patrol. The first one is a Sagittor ATV. Now, these guys are little sort of light transport vehicles. They are relatively fast and they hit kind of hard. A lot of times you'll take a beam cannon on this guy, which is a good anti-tank weapon. However, the big benefit that they have is that they're able to take your Hearthkin Warrior unit and split it into 2 units of 5. Usually we call these a combat squad kind of effect, because that's the original incarnation of this effect is from the Space Marine Tactical Squad, which allows them to combat squad into 2 units of 5, rather than being taken in 1 unit of 10. This gives you the use of a unit with a bunch of heavy weapons from the team, plus a unit with a bunch of regular bolt guns that you can use to camp your back objective. They have an objective secured effect, so when they hold an objective at the end of your command phase, they lock it in under your control until somebody takes it, which lets them lock in your home objective, and if your opponent's not threatening it, they can just wander up and go do actions and score points elsewhere. So this is an incredibly useful unit to have. And the addition of the Sagittor basically adds 2 units to your army, because you're going to be able to split the Hearthkin Warriors into 2 to be more useful out on the battlefield, and then you also gain the Sagittor as a unit as well. So that's an incredibly useful sort of little brick to take. But in addition, we've also added 5 additional Einhir Hearthguard to the unit. Now, the reason for this is that we're going to be utilizing a combination inside Nidgard Oathband. Now, a lot of times in these tutorial series, I don't usually kind of build around particular enhancement combinations. However, I will in this case, because we start with the Einhir Champion and the Einhir Hearthguard in the combat patrol. Now, we're going to be using the Oathbound Speculator enhancement. This is a relatively expensive enhancement, but it gives you wound rerolls of 1. The unit itself all gets hit rerolls of 1 baked in as a data sheet ability, so you're rerolling 1s to hit and wound all the time. In addition, you can spend 3 yield points when they shoot in order to gain +1 to wound, and the unit attacks at a very high volume. Typically, I think with this case, we're going to be most likely taking their plasma guns. If they're able to get in their rapid fire range, each model is shooting 2 times with a 2 damage weapon, plus you're also getting additional shots from the Autok Bolter on the Einhir Champion, and each of them fires an additional D3 blast attacks from their grenade launchers as well. So each individual model can be attacking up to 7 times, and all of those together with +1 to wound, plus hit and wound rerolls, and you can stack Ancestral Sentence on top of that as well, is an immense amount of volume. Now, in the early games, this is likely where you're going to be putting Ancestral Sentence, and generally speaking, with Nidgard Oathband, finding a place to use Ancestral Sentence to get the most value out of that stratagem is going to be where a lot of your thought process goes. You want at least 1 big brick to be available to use the stratagem at any one time if they have an important thing to shoot at. The other thing here is that these guys will also sort of double dip from that Oathbound Speculator because they have a solid melee profile as well as a good range profile. So they can walk up if you have enough yield points in your bank. Remember, you're going to be gaining them from killing enemy units as well. So if you've skirmished, killed any enemy units with, for example, your Brokir Thunderkin, you could potentially have a lot to spend with these guys. They can get +1 to wound, plus a bunch of rerolls on their shooting attack, and then you can do the same thing, charge them into melee, do the same thing in melee, plus some mortal wounds from the Einhir Champion on top of that. So that enhancement is incredibly strong on big units like this that make a ton of attacks. As I mentioned before, however, there are other places that you could be putting this enhancement. So if you didn't want to fork out for additional Einhir Hearthguard, we could be taking things like Ironkin Steeljacks, who are also incredibly good with that combination. Now, when it comes to playing this army on the battlefield, we're actually going to be starting the vast majority of it off the table. Most of this is going to be encapsulated in transports. However, the Einhir Hearthguard are going to start in reserve. Now, a nice benefit of having a Einhir Champion inside the Hearthguard unit is that it frees up the unit to take their Weave Field Crest. So they can gain a unit-wide invulnerable save, and the Einherjar champion can take a teleport crest to allow that unit to teleport onto the battlefield. Now, we can include up to 50% of our army in reserve at the beginning of the game, and so that's what we're going to be doing here. And these guys with that teleport crest, whether that's on the unit champion or on the Einherjar champion, they're going to be able to deep strike, and we're going to use rapid ingress to try to get them into the fight. Now, in addition to that, we're also going to have a couple of units hiding inside transports from the beginning of the game. Now, what we want to do is use our Sagittor to split up our Hardskin Warriors so that we have a unit that can, in the very early game, range out and take an objective from round 1. So depending on what secondary objectives you draw, you have a unit that can immediately run out and start to complete those. And from there, the Sagittor can either act as an objective holder, or it can engage with its laser cannons and start to do some damage. In addition to that, we usually want to take the heavy weapons and special bin carriers in the Hardskin Warrior unit and split them off into the Sagittor, because there's a much greater chance that as the game goes on, we could potentially get the Sagittor onto this objective in a future turn, disembark these guys, and use them to move and attack into the middle of the table or into your opponent's deployment zone. So we may get more use out of those heavy weapons. The other unit is unlikely to do too much damage, so we're not really worried about its damage output, so we're going to put the generic troops in the unit in that half. You want to start these guys on your home objective so they can use their ability to objective secure it under your control, and then they can start to range out and go do some other stuff. If your opponent is threatening you with deep strikes, they can screen the objective. Just make sure that every part of the objective is within 9 inches of one of the warriors, and your opponent won't be able to deep strike naturally onto the objective. They can also go out and just screen other parts of your deployment zone as well. Or if your opponent isn't threatening control of that objective, they can simply run out and start to go try to compete for other objectives as the game moves on. Now, essentially what we want to do is force our opponent to engage with our army with this Hekaton Land Fortress. So the Land Fortress, you don't want to throw it out willy-nilly if your opponent has absolutely, like, sort of brutal anti-tank. However, it's okay to play a little aggressively with it. It's very difficult to kill. Many armies won't be able to profitably engage with it super easily. And even if they do, we're going to have these units of Brokir Thunderkid in here. Now, if the Land Fortress is able to get a shot on something important, and if you're playing it aggressively, it's going to be able to do so, you can disembark the Brokir Thunderkid. They can move out and shoot at that target first to remove cover from it. Then you can attack it with the Hekaton Land Fortress. And this is why Brokir Thunderkid are one of the best support units in the army, because they have their capacity to strip cover from enemies. Now, in this mode, you usually want to be equipping these guys with their Graviton blast cannons, because that represents the highest just initial damage output without any additional buffs on them. However, there is a reason to take SP heavy conversion beamers when we move on to talking about using a larger unit in Strike Force games. So we want to be using these Brokir Thunderkin to either threaten control of objectives when the Land Fortress dies. When you lose a transport, you can disembark your models wholly within 3 inches of it. So if you have the Hekaton Land Fortress on or near an objective and you lose the Land Fortress, as long as your opponent doesn't have anything in threat range that can shoot or charge these guys, you can just disembark them onto the objective. They'll unbattle shock when it comes back to your turn, and then you'll hold the objective and take it. In addition to that, if your opponent doesn't kill the Land Fortress, then they're going to have to deal with the Brokir Thunderkin. They're going to have to deal with the Brokir Thunderkin stripping cover from them, and then the Land Fortress shooting them and probably putting them down. The Land Fortress in the early turns is also a solid place to put Ancestral Sentence, because it can potentially buff their cannon shot. Their turret-mounted cannon is oftentimes best to take it as a Magna Rail cannon, but in some instances, you do kind of want to take an SP Heavy Conversion Beamer, because it gives you enhanced critical hits if you're outside of 12 inches of your opponent, which you can then use Ancestral Sentence to get additional hits off of. So you're getting critical hit on a 4+ rather than only a 6, which both triggers lethal hits from the weapon profile and also the sustained hits too from the stratagem. And this is the primary way, using these conversion beamers, that we're going to be getting additional value out of that strat. That said, most of its weapons sustain already, so it doesn't get too much of a benefit from it. So if you're not running the SP conversion beamer, I wouldn't be using that strat. However, it's sort of dealer's choice whether or not you want to be putting that weapon on it. It depends on how long of a distance you want to engage with your opponent. If you feel like you prefer to hang the Land Fortress a little bit back, so it's easier to attack enemies that are outside 12 inches, then the conversion beamer is pretty good. Otherwise, if you want to ram it up into your opponent's face, it's largely a playstyle thing. Then you want to be taking the Magna Rail cannon to do the maximum damage. Now, as soon as your opponent comes in to attack the land fortress, and they'll have to really sort of work pretty hard to get rid of it. You can use Rapid Ingress on the Einherjar Hearthguard to put them in a position to counterattack whatever's attacking the land fortress. So in the early turns, what you want to do is essentially set up a position where your land fortress is threatening control of an objective. You want to sort of play this a little cagey if your opponent has a lot of, especially really long-range anti-tank, but they'll probably post up to kill it. They might have to charge into it in order to actually get rid of it. If that's the case and they have to do that, you can Rapid Ingress the Einherjar Hearthguard behind it. On the subsequent turn, they can simply move forward, shoot, and then charge whatever attacks the land fortress and consolidate control of the center objective. And from there, you can basically just kind of bully the game out with this big unit of guys. They get some charge bonuses from the Einherjar champion, so they're able to close the distance even if their movement characteristic isn't too fast. But essentially what you want to do is force your opponent to commit in and actually expose the resources to attack the land fortress. Put these guys in the perfect position to not take too much damage on your opponent's turn, and then countercharge those elements, and then these guys are going to be able to clear the way for you. Once you're in round 3 onwards, essentially, you're probably going to have enough yield points to fuel both your Oathbound Speculator and Ancestral Sentence if you need to, and you can start to pump yield points into this unit to do the maximum damage. Now, you're not going to be able to do that for more than a round or so, especially if you're using Oathbound Speculator for +1 to wound both in shooting and melee. You might only get that once or twice. However, if you do have enough yield points to be able to do that, these guys are going to pop off and they're going to be able to sort of close the game out really well from there. So that's essentially the game plan that we're going to try to execute with an Incursion style game, and we're doing something similar when we move on to Strike Force. Now, when we're moving over to Strike Force game modes, we're adding essentially a ton of scoring and a little bit of redundancy to this army. One thing that you want to be able to do, because you want to generate yield points from holding objectives, is very consistently be able to range out and to take objectives in order to gain those yield points to spend to fuel things like your Oathbound Speculator and your Ancestral Sentence. So what we're going to be doing in this case is adding a ton of utility to the army. This includes a unit of Hernkin Pioneers. These guys are scouts naturally, so they begin the game by moving up to 9 inches to take forward positions. A lot of times what you're going to try to do with these guys is give them the opportunity to jump behind terrain features in the center of the battlefield to give you the best opportunity to run out and grab objectives. They're also relatively high objective control characteristic because they're OC2 each. Now that's the same as a Hearthkin Warrior, although Hearthkin Warriors come in larger units. However, most of your other utility units are only OC1. And so having a higher objective control characteristic on the Hernkin Pioneers allows you to potentially steal objectives from lighter enemy units a little bit more efficiently. And that is something that is important to keep in mind with Leagues of Votann, because taking objectives for your yield points is so important. Preserving those high OC units is a big deal. Now, in addition to that, we've added a second Hecatan land fortress, and we've also added some additional units to embark within them. The two in this case are units of Chthonian Berserks. These are very good sort of melee counterpunch attackers. They are very good at attacking enemies that are nearby. They're relatively slow, so they aren't necessarily going to be ranging out to aggressively attack your opponent's objectives. However, if we are playing as aggressively with the Hecatan land fortresses, as I discussed in the Incursion game size part of the video, then oftentimes the Chthonian Berserks are going to be able to jump out and attack stuff that you don't necessarily need things like your Einherjar Hearthguard to do. So that gives you more redundancy on the battlefield where you can kill smaller enemy units without having to commit your larger attackers. In addition to that, we've also added a Capricus Carrier, as well as a unit of Hernkin Jaegers. Now, the Carrier has the same ability that the Sagittary does for Hearthkin Warriors, but he does it for Hernkin Jaegers. So he's able to take a Jaeger unit and split it into 2 smaller units of 5. Now, the Hernkin Jaegers are one of the best objective holding units that you have in the Codex. They have a reactive move, so sometimes your opponent has a tough time actually getting to grips with them. And you can even, if you roll high enough on that reactive move, use that to re-embark them into the transport so that you can disembark them from the transport, go do an action or complete a secondary with them, keep the transport nearby, and if your opponent moves up to attack those Jaegers, they can go back in the transport to try to preserve themselves. In addition, having another unit of 5 of these guys just makes your ability to interact on objectives way, way, way better. Now, on top of that, we also have some additional efficiency in the form form of a Memnir strategist. This little guy is going to generate you yield points. He's going to sit on your home objective with your Hearthkin warriors basically all game, and he's going to gain you yield points every battle round, which is going to go even farther to fuel things like your Ancestral Sentence and your Oathbound Speculator. So all your stratagems are going to get easier to use once we get to this higher level Strike Force game mode. Now, that being the case, a lot of times you won't necessarily need to, in Incursion games, use the stratagems quite as often, but obviously you will be using them basically every turn once you get up to Strike Force games, so being able to generate yield points passively is an important thing. On top of that, we also have Uthar the Destined. This guy is an epic hero who gives you free stratagems targeting units within 12 inches of them. Because most of the time you're going to be trying to use Ancestral Sentence on your turn in order to deal additional damage, and you're going to be trying to use Void Hardened on your opponent's turn, or even the stratagem to attack back when your opponent shoots you, this detachment tends to spend a lot of command points just buffing itself over the course. And so Uthar the Destined giving you an additional command point effectively every single turn or every single battle round is a huge increase in efficiency. So this guy is really great for that. He also, if you have yield points to spend on him, because he can flip his wound rolls to 6s to trigger devastating damage, he can deal some serious damage by himself. So as a little bit of a late game piece, he can wander in and actually start to mix it up and maybe clear out an enemy unit or two. So that is our increase to the Strike Force game size, basically taking a lot of these same principles that we discussed in the original game, in the Incursion level game mode, and are expanding it out to a larger game mode that's then going to have more access to yield points. Now, moving over to playing games with the Strike Force army, a lot of the original concepts that we discussed when playing with an Incursion army are going to be relatively similar. A lot of the combos we're trying to use are going to be the same. However, we have a lot more board control in this build than we did in the previous Incursion build. This allows us to do things like scout our units like Hernkin Pioneers up to central objectives and behind terrain features in the early game. This gives them the capacity to run up and touch these objectives early, and then potentially range out and try to disrupt the enemy control of central objectives or even their home objective later on. And that, of course, is going to score you yield points in your opponent's command phase if you hold those objectives on Battle Round 2 onwards, but also disrupt their primary scoring to keep their score low. And that's going to require them to engage with you, and that's all you want. You basically want to engage in a fair fight as a Votann army, because if your opponent simply comes out and fights you on the objectives, you are likely to win those battles. So your scouting units, like your Hernkin Pioneers and your Capricus Carrier, you want to keep them in positions where they can get to terrain features that they can very easily hide behind on turn 1. So start them in positions where they can run up behind these terrain features so they can absorb more board control, they can threaten control of central objectives or scoring secondaries, and from a relatively safe position. Similarly, we also have a Hernkin Jaeger squad of 5 that gets combat squatted out by the Capricus Carrier. These guys can either deploy in a position to hold objectives from round 1 onwards, or if your opponent has their own infiltrate or scout units, you can actually just sort of spread them in a line in front of your opponent's army in order to prevent those units from setting up in an easy position. You can even broadcast this on Tabletop Simulator. You could potentially put them in a position like this on this particular mission layout, where you actually prevent your opponent from being able to take advantage of this really nice deployment spot for infiltrate or scout units, because they're not able to get near that. Now, obviously, you are giving up a unit in order to do so. However, the benefit is that you're only giving up 5 Hernkin Jaegers if you end up in that position, because the other 5 are going to be in the Capricus Carrier, so you can just replace those guys with the additional unit by disembarking and then moving them up later on. So these guys are really useful based on what your opponent's doing. If they are trying to use those forward operators to block you out, you can use them to try to fight over the mid-board with that, or you can simply use them as a unit that can run out and complete secondaries early on in the game. Now, we have a little sort of cadre of support characters in the back here. The Memnir strategist can't attach into anything, so he's just going to be by himself for the most part, but you want him to hold on to your home objective to generate you yield points all game. If you want to get kind of crazy with it, you can also enhance him with the Dead Reckoning enhancement to gain additional yield points. So you have more outlets to generate more yield points early on in the game, and that can fuel things like your Oathbound Speculator even more easily. From there, we also have the Sagittor, which we can use to range out and start to attack your opponent's objectives to keep them off off balance on scoring. And as always, we want to set up in a position where we can stage our Hecatan land fortresses in an aggressive position, probably at the bottom of turn 1. Make sure your opponent can't get crippling anti-tank on them that can kill them easily. And then we want to push in round 2 in order to try to secure control of those central objectives to generate more yield points. From there, the game plan is very similar to what we discussed in the Incursion game mode. You effectively want to try to get value out of your land fortresses by killing enemy utility units or lighter stuff, and then force your opponent to come back in and attack them. I recommend that you begin a Brokir Thunderkin unit and a unit of Chthonian Berserks inside each Hecatan land fortress. This is because it gives you a lot of flexibility on the battlefield. If you need to strip cover from something or destroy an enemy unit that is a lighter, vehicle unit that the Graviton Blast Cannons can sort of bully, the Brokir Thunderkin can simply disembark the Hecatan land fortress, wander out, and go do that by themselves. They're relatively cheap, they're an expendable unit, so being able to deal some damage to something and strip cover from your opponent is a huge bonus. Now, on the flip side, the Chthonian Berserks are a good counterpunch. If your opponent comes in to try to either take this objective or kill the Hecatan land fortress, the Chthonian Berserks can disembark the land fortress and then counter-attack them just fine. Now, if they're all on the battlefield, their threat range is not super long, so outside of a position where, for example, your opponent's like fighting over this objective and you have them staged in a ruin like this, that's about as far as they're going to get. They're not really particularly aggressive units because they don't have that many movement bonuses. They're just moving their normal 6 inches and then charging. So while you want to threaten positions where you can sort of disembark and then charge into your opponent's home with them, the capacity that you normally get used in is to attack enemies that try to come kill the land fortress. Now, the one thing I would keep in mind with the Chthonian Berserks is that, unfortunately for them, their accuracy is very low. So I would essentially never engage with them if you aren't benefiting from one of the +1 to hit bonuses from the army ability, from Prioritized Efficiency. So whether you are either holding an objective that they're standing on with the Fortified Takeover, or your opponent is on an objective with hostile acquisition. If you don't have either one of those effects active, these guys become really inconsistent. Whereas if you're hitting on 3s, they are still a little inconsistent because they have very few rerolls or anything like that. However, their potential damage output's really high because if you're taking concussion mauls with them, they're anti-monster and anti-vehicle 3+. So they wound basically most units in the game on 3s. And you're also getting potentially some additional damage out of twin concussion gauntlets as well, which are twin linked, so they're good into basically any target. So it's a relatively low volume of attacks, but the attacks are really, really high impact. So unfortunately, it's very inconsistent, but your opponent has to respect that threat because there is the potential that they just kill them. However, if you're just rolling 4s to hit, you can't really expect too much work from them because their volume is going to be relatively low. So I would basically always try to set up situations where you're going to be engaging enemies on objectives with them. The Chthonian Berserks get really weird if you aren't doing that. And then from there, if your opponent extends pretty heavily into them, we can use the Einhir Hearthguard to, as we talked about before, rapid ingress from Deep Strike to deploy on your opponent's turn, and then wander up, shoot and charge whatever is attacking your big vehicles, and then kill them, secure control of the middle of the table, and then sort of roll out to victory from there. Now, the other big brick that we have in the army is a unit of 6 Brokir Thunderkin. Now, this is very common inside a Nidgard Oathband because of the combination of the SP Conversion Beamer conversion ability. So if you fire at an enemy unit outside 12 inches, you get 4+ critical hits rather than only 6s. So Ancestral Sentence gives you sustained hits too. As we mentioned before, you get 4+ criticals with conversion, so you get lethal hits from the Conversion Beamer's profile itself, plus sustained hits 2 for an additional 2 hits. If you have another Brokir Thunderkin unit firing at the same time, you can strip cover from your target, and then these guys are basically just pure value at that point. So the damage output potential from these guys is really high if you have Ancestral Sentence active. Now, they're a little difficult to get engaged into most targets because they are relatively slow, and your opponent's going to try to play around their board position. So you can put them in strategic reserve so they can come in off the board edges and either use rapid ingress or simply come out of reserve normally when they have a target in order to sort of get value from them. The other option is that you could put them in a land fortress instead of all of its other occupants. So you could leave Brokir Thunderkin either in reserve or on the battlefield. Same with Chthonian Berserks. You can leave them on the battlefield or disembark them into a position and sort of disembark from the transport and then run behind a ruin or something so that they can charge the next turn, and then embark the transport with all the Brokir Thunderkin with conversion beamers in order to try to then follow up with that unit. So basically, you want to be setting up situations where you're either using Ancestral Sentence on these guys or these guys each turn that you have it available. Each time that you have the requisite number of yield points to spend and you have a good target for it. And then obviously you have a bunch of guys in the back that are going to be generating those yield points for you so that you can fuel these units to do that damage. Now, Uthar the Destined wants to follow up with the army in order to keep mostly the land fortresses and potentially some of your other units in range to gain those free stratagems, especially if you are using Ancestral Sentence and you're during your turn, like you know that's where one command point is going to be going. So keeping Uthar or moving Uthar into a point where he can get within 12 inches to give them a free stratagem is important. If your opponent has long-ranged attacks or fast units or indirect fire that could attack him and kill him, you can attach him to the Hearthkin Warriors so the Hearthkin Warriors can take damage for him, the unit of 5 that you combat squad out from the Sagittor. Otherwise, he can also operate just as another unit, just to increase your unit volume to give you more opportunities to take objectives and things. So he doesn't necessarily have to be by himself, although he is very effective by himself if your opponent doesn't have really strong shooting, because he can just run in and hide in ruins and stuff, and then project that free command point aura, and then move out to attack people on objectives in the future. Understanding how level of control and objective control works is an important part of playing armies like these, because the generation of yield points is so important. It's always important to keep in mind that you can generate yield points just by killing enemies, so if your opponent is feeding you units in order to complete secondaries, you are going to be getting a pretty good number of yield points yourself. Some of your effects require that you remain in Fortify Takeover. For example, Void Hardened and Reactive Reprisal both unlock when you're in Fortify Takeover. You can't use them when you're in a Hostile Acquisition, so you probably won't be able to use those until Battle Round 2 or 3. So that's an important thing to keep in mind, and it's one reason to hold yield points until you can use those. However, once you can spend those yield points on things like Oathbound Speculator and on your Ancestral Sentence, the potential damage that you get out of this army is pretty extreme. It's important to keep in mind and remember that you generate yield points each player's turn, so you can be generating them during your opponent's turn. So running out and stealing objectives from your opponent can score you points when it goes back to their turn, score you those yield points, which is a big deal for unlocking that Fortified Takeover mode of your ability. But with that, those are my tips for how to get started with Leagues of Votann. This army plays relatively straightforward. A lot of what it does is basically just fair 40k, but with its high resilience and the special abilities that it gains from its army ability, it can actually do quite a bit, because it essentially has two sources of resources that it can spend to enhance its stratagems, not just command points. Those yield points can also go a really long way. However, generating and managing those yield points is an important part of the faction in any case. Expanding this army, there is a lot of potential ways that you can go. As I mentioned before, you can expand into some other units. While units like the Brokir, Thunderkin, and Hearthkin Warriors and Chthonian Berserks are going to be used in most of your armies, you can swap out things like the Einhir Hearthguard and some of the other utility for different options, either taking things like Ironkin Steeljacks or more Chthonian Berserks or more of your more standard options, or even more vehicles like Capricus, Hecatons, and Sagittors. So it's definitely not a requirement that you play as infantry heavy as this build is. However, if you do like infantry-based lists, you can go full Chthonian Berserk heavy in a Delve Assault Shift if you like the Chthonian playstyle. That plays a very different style of game than most of the other detachments in Leagues of Votann. So if you want to play more aggressive, kind of almost a World Eaters, like melee-oriented style, that detachment is incredibly good for it. It makes your infantry very resilient, it allows you to regenerate Chthonian Berserks, and it allows you to deep strike those Chthonian Berserks, basically using them very similar to how the Einhir Hearthguard get used in the builds that we made in this case, because they're able to rapid ingress into weird positions of the table, and then you can buff their movement and get them onto your opponent's objectives really early. So that detachment is good if you are a more aggressive melee-oriented player. If you want to do more stuff with the vehicles, you can also play Brandfast Oathband. That has a lot more interesting vehicle synergies and some interesting chicanery that you can do with those vehicles, and deep striking or teleporting units nearby them in order to gain sustained hits, doing strange stuff with disembarking them in order to steal your opponent's objectives in a position where they weren't necessarily anticipating. So there's a lot of really interesting ways that you can use things like the Land Fortress and the Sagittors and the Capricus in that detachment. But with that, let me know down in the comment section what your Leagues of Votann army is going to look like, what you thought about the list that I built in this case, and which faction you would like me to cover next on this series. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.